Okay, welcome everybody. As Ellie said, this is a real treat for me. In fact, it's particularly significant because it's almost like my two worlds colliding or synchronizing, shall I say. The wonderful home of South Hampstead that we treasure so much, and my spiritual anchor, Shani Taragin, who really, if we spoke all the accolades, we'd be here a long time. And I want to get to actually learn some Torah and speak about some of the pressing issues for Jewry in the world today. But I think for the purposes of our discussion, Shani, together with her husband, are the directors of education for World Mizrachi. So what we've seen this weekend, and so many of us who are really gaining so much from this weekend, it's a real feat. And Yashar Kopachem, thank you.
Thank you.
Shani as well, it was one of the first Yoatzot Halacha, the first cohort of women who were trained as halachic advisors, which must have been
24 years,
25 years ago, and has been at the forefront of women's education since that point, in which there have been so many changes. And as I mentioned, really for me, when the sages say, find yourself somebody who can be your teacher and your spiritual mentor and your guide, that's been you for really over 20 years. And in fact, I never used this notebook, but this is the notebook that has my notes from before I even got married, and Shani and I have learned together in Israel and in America. I have now cross-continent. So I thought I'll pull it out for the occasions that we can continue that conversation together.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really the highlight, not just of my day, but of the entire weekend. And I've been looking forward to this one. Thank you.
So if you don't mind indulging me, I want to go back to the first time that I encountered you. Your name had preceded you, but I remember so clearly the moment that I first really learned Torah with you. And that was in my gap year, or one of my gap years, I should say, standing on a hilltop in Jerusalem. And they said, the teacher's going to appear in a minute. She's going to appear in a minute. And this lady walked out with a Tanakh in her hands. And suddenly, this hilltop that was just a beautiful hilltop in Jerusalem, that you did have a sense of the ancient and the new coming together, but we weren't quite sure what. Suddenly the pages of the Tanakh were opened and we were taken back in time, and yet we're still standing as a cohort in the today of Jerusalem. And I think that's one of the things, is one of your passions, is to do these trips of taking the Bible and bringing it to life in Israel. And so I wondered, with the approach of Jerusalem Day this week, which is of course part of the inspiration of this weekend of Mizrachi, if maybe you could share with us, what is your favorite Tanakh Til to do? What's your favorite place to take and to guide and to bring that story to life?
Oh, that is beautiful. So my students know whenever I take them throughout the lands of Israel, I always say, this is my favorite Tanakh Til, wherever I happen to be at that moment. So, and now as I think of Yerushalayim, and my favorite place in Yerushalayim. So I would even start slightly outside of Yerushalayim, in order to appreciate where we're coming, in order to, just like Am Yisrael, yearning for Hamakom Asher Yibchar Hashem. So to start, ideally even by the Jordan River crossing, by Kasar al Yehud, to feel just like Am Yisrael coming into Eretz Yisrael, seeing Yericho directly across from us, being able to say, it's one of the few places in Eretz Yisrael where you can say the bracha with Shem and Malchut, Ava Shasa Lanu Nisim B'Makom Hazeh, to remember the miracles performed during the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. At that time, then proceeding to Mitzvah Yericho, seeing the rebuilding. And then ideally, I would go to Shiloh on the way to appreciate also what we had standing for 369 years, and then to make our way to as close as we can to Har HaBayit. Say one of my favorite, again, they're all my favorite places, but really to not just go to the Kotel where we're surrounded to a certain degree by the wall, the exterior wall that was once around Har HaBayit, but to go to the eastern side, to go to the side where Rabbi Akiva looks with his peers and is able to see the area of Har, from Har HaTzofim all the way to Kodesh HaKadoshim. Today, Baruch Hashem, we can go atop Har HaZitim and see from the top of one of the areas that was purchased from the Arabs, right across from the areas of of Har HaZitim to see from Beit HaChoshen, as it's known, all the way to Har HaBayit. You can actually see from there the Kuba right in front of the Dome of the Rock. You can picture, almost like Rabbi Akiva, you can picture the jackals running out of Kodesh Kodashim. And on one hand, when you're tempted to cry together with his peers, you then remember the laughter of Rabbi Akiva. And you can picture as Rabbi Akiva, as you see all of the surrounding hills of Yerushalayim, the rebuilt, not only beautiful apartment buildings, but the shuls and the schools, the yeshivot, the midrashot, to be able to laugh with Rabbi Akiva and understand that it's ridiculous to see the paths of destruction. You see as you overlook, and I'll take all of you when you come, to go to at the top of Har HaZitim and to be able to see the fulfillment of the prophecies of Zechariah. Od yeshvuz kenos kenon b'chavod Yerushalayim. V'ish mishanto b'yado b'rov yamin v'yeladim misachakim b'rechovoteha. And you literally can see children playing all around the streets of Yerushalayim. There's no greater scene than that.
Wow, fantastic. If we're talking about the Rabbi Akiva looking on the destruction and his colleagues crying and him laughing, let's talk about Rabbi Akiva. If it's Jerusalem and Jerusalem Day is coming up, I wonder, as not only having thousands of students around the world, but now really being a teacher of teachers, and so much at the forefront of women's education. You know, the story of Rabbi Akiva, that we celebrate how he only came to start to become literate and learn Hebrew when he was 40, and his wife Rachel, who had given up a life of wealth for him, she said, go and learn Torah, and I will wait for you in poverty. And it's a beautiful story, but in some ways, looking at the world today as a woman scholar in a modern world, doesn't it tell a story of sort of women sacrifice while the men pursue scholarship? How would you frame that story?
So beautiful that you asked, because I think about this very often, especially now during the Sfirat HaOmer. I think there are two dominant personalities that come to our minds during this time period. And one is Rabbi Akiva, because of the tragic deaths of 24,000 of his students. And at the same time, as we anticipate Chag HaShavuot, we can't help but think about Moshe Rabbeinu. And Chazal go out of their way to draw numerous parallels between these two personalities. And I think one of them is with regard to their family relationships. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Chazal teach us in Gemara Shabbat, Moshe Rabbeinu separated from his wife, Tzipporah. And if we would just end with Moshe Rabbeinu, which one could even argue really is depictive of his time, his intense communication with God, tells us that in order to be Moshe Rabbeinu, you have to be somewhat celibate. You have to separate from your wife. Comes along Rabbi Akiva, of whom we hear, as Lauren mentioned, the beautiful romantic background of his wife Rachel, seeing the midot, the wonderful character traits of Rabbi Akiva, and being willing not just to send him for 12 years, but another 12 years. And then he comes back, if you remember, he comes back and she comes with her tattered clothing, and his own students don't recognize who she is. And he says, Shafkuha, leave her alone. Shali v'shalachem shalahi. He says, your Torah, my Torah belongs to her. And I think Chazal already telling us because times have changed. And it's not, you don't have to separate from your wife. As a matter of fact, you should marry someone who is committed to Torah. If you marry someone who has that commitment to Torah, then you can become like Rabbi Akiva. And don't think that you're not supposed to have a family life. On the contrary, you're supposed to have a wife and you're supposed to have children. And through someone committed, which is really what's going on behind, I would say, behind the scenes and between the lines of the entire Rabbi Akiva stories, beginning with you seeing the crowns that HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts on letters, and then he provides a crown for his own wife, called Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which really is a tiara with engraved Yerushalayim, which is the greatest expression of one's commitment. So she's who's
can you just tell us a little bit more about this story? Fill in the gap for us.
What a beautiful story. So the story actually begins with Moshe Rabbeinu going up to Har Sinai, and he sees God putting crowns on top of certain letters of the Torah. He says, God, mi ma'akev al yadecha. God, why are you doing this? We've been waiting for the Torah. And Hashem says, because there's going to be, in hundreds of years from now, someone named Akiva ben Yosef, and he's going to explain these crowns. Now, what's interesting is we don't find any explanations of the crowns. So you have to look at other stories of Rabbi Akiva. One of the most famous ones is another story of a crown. As Lauren mentioned, when they're living in poverty, they're living in a barn because Rachel, albeit she's from a very wealthy background, her father, Kalba Sabua, completely and disenfranchised her from any property. And they live in a terrible, terrible poverty, but it's so beautiful. Rabbi Akiva every morning wakes up, and it says that he takes the strands of hay from her hair. And as he does so, he says, one day, Rachel, I'm going to give you Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. And I always look at that story and recognize that it's not just that he's pulling out probably golden hay, golden straw from her hair, but rather he's thinking about her hair and her head as representing the letters of the Torah. And he himself already pictures her with those crowns that Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about, because he sees in her, she's the one who says, Akiva, you're going to go off and learn Torah. He sees in her that commitment. And sure enough, years later, he's the one to come and provide her with this beautiful, beautiful crown. In place of that golden hay in her hair, she now wears a tiara of Yerushalayim. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why Yerushalayim? Might give her, I don't know, a golden, a diamond-studded crown. But for Rabbi Akiva, Yerushalayim, as we just mentioned in that famous story, Yerushalayim represents the commitment to Torah of our past and of our future. And that's what he wants to grant her, showing that she's really the one. She's like a letter of the Sefer Torah who gets her own crown. So much so that the leading Nasi at the time, Rabban Gamliel, so his wife says, why did you buy me such a crown? And I heard the wealthy man, he says, did you cut off all of your hair, her Rabbi Akiva, so that he could learn Torah? Did you show the same commitment? And no one deserves it more than Rachel, the wife of Rabbi Akiva. But if you ask about the changing roles of women, so I think that when we compare the stories, and we see Moshe Rabbeinu's time, Rabbi Akiva's time, when his wife was the one to express commitment to Torah, then I think that now we're in a generation where it's not just about her formal commitment to Torah, not just about supporting one in Torah, but just as we find from other sugyot in Shas, that there's a debate whether or not women themselves should be involved in Torah. And Ben Azai's opinion in Gemara Sota is that women have to be involved in Torah. You have to educate women in Torah, not only to prevent her from becoming promiscuous and leading a wayward life, but how are we ever going to be committed to Torah in general unless we understand the depth of Torah? If we're not exposed to that content, then what are we really supporting? And particularly today, when we have so many opportunities of expanding our knowledge in so many areas, how can our not only commitment, but knowledge to Torah remain deficient? So yes, I think we have a different role today, and that is not only to be the supporters, and I would say we should continue definitely to engage our homes as houses of Torah, but the only way to really do that, especially with all the information that's out there in our modern world, is if we're not just the supporters, but the providers of words of Torah.
Mm-hmm. So I would love to develop this, is how we can, if we want to say that we want to deepen our understanding of Torah, that there are more opportunities today, is to look at this on a few levels. So if you're talking about Jerusalem, Yerushalayim representing being the place of Torah study, and I'm looking around and seeing several people here whose children have spent time this year in Jerusalem learning, and you're teaching several times a week in Jerusalem. What do you see? Do you see that it's different when you are teaching about Judaism in Jerusalem? And how have you seen that change over, 30 years of doing that?
Indeed. So firstly, I never get tired of coming to Yerushalayim. I now teach in Yerushalayim every day, and I live directly south of Yerushalayim in Gush Etzion. And when you go through the mountains of Yehuda, and this is beautiful, the topography is actually, and the altitude higher than that of Yerushalayim. We go through tunnels. So when you come out of the tunnels, it could be very windy and very cloudy in Gush Etzion, and you come out and you feel Yerushalayim Orosh Olam. usually the sun is shining, unlike here. But usually, then the Avira, the atmosphere of Yerushalayim overtakes one. And as I also go through these mountains every day, I don't think there's a single day that I don't think about what it means, as you mentioned before, about bringing Tanakh to life. I think about this is the same path that Abraham and Yaakov took on their way from the northern hills of Eretz Yisrael all the way to Hebron and Beersheba. This is the path of David HaMelech, and the panorama hasn't changed that much, albeit Baruch Hashem, there definitely is the growth of settlement. And then to know that you're coming to Yerushalayim. When Yeshayahu HaNavi tells us about the end of days, the eschatological times when not only Jews, but universally, people are going to recognize that teachings, moral teachings, religious teachings stem from Yerushalayim. You literally see that being fulfilled today. You come in, it's not just every few homes is another Beit Knesset, but it's another Beit Midrash. In addition to obviously seeing the relics of the past and the religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the mosques and the churches and the beautiful synagogues, both of the past, but also Baruch Hashem of the present. You even see, as my husband teaches in Yeshivat HaKotel, and right outside Yeshivat HaKotel, you have the Chorva synagogue, which now also houses another yeshiva of study, and you see how it's being rebuilt. And then another Beit Knesset from the time period of the second Beit Mikdash right outside the door of Yeshivat HaKotel also being rebuilt. And it's fascinating to see just the revival and hundreds of yeshivot, but also midrashot. Wherever I'm teaching that day, I'm either in the southern areas of Yerushalayim, on the western, the eastern, the northern. And as I drive from seminary to seminary, I think to myself, this is truly remarkable that this didn't exist 30 years ago. Maybe there were 4 or 5 seminaries. Today, there are over 40 seminaries just for North Americans to come and to learn, in addition to another 30 for Israelis. And to see predominantly the growth of Talmud Torah L'Nashim is enthralling and inspiring. And it's not just about the quantity, but the quality as well. To know that these women are literally creating the future for Am Yisrael, as they're the ones learning Torah, who will ultimately be committed to the Torah, but also transform their homes and communities into Torah-oriented ones.
Amazing. So when the sages said that Yerushalayim is 2 words brought together, it's Hara'ah, education, and Shalom, peace. You're saying you really feel that it is that hub of education to world Jewry.
Yes.
Maybe the peace part we're still all praying for.
We are, and yet I think that when you look back at the story of Shalom, it starts with Melchizedek Melech Shalem. And a part of what he stands for is not just the peace, but the idea of engaging with others, that the Ben Adam L'Chavero, that chesed, that kindness. After Avram comes back weary from war, he's the one to provide him with food and beverage. And that's something that you see in Yerushalayim as well. In addition to the Torah, the Hora'ah, the Yir'ah, you also sense the chesed that goes on. And by the way, don't believe everything that you hear in the news. When you hear about the judicial reform that you'll speak about from a legal perspective with Gil Hoffman, but when people tell you that, yes, there are demonstrations and the country is torn apart, it's true that there are certain values that have been latent and tensions within Israeli society because we're all one family with many, many different views. So yes, they're now a little bit more on the surface, but when you walk the streets of Yerushalayim, you feel that everyone is your brother and sister, and no one will not help you because of your political views or your religious views. There really is a sense of Achinu Kol Beit Yisrael, so we may not have that world peace that eventually is going to come from Yerushalayim, but we definitely have the values of peace and the Ben Adam L'Chavero, the Chasadim that take place in Yerushalayim that you feel day in and day out.
We're talking female scholarship, and let's go back to when you started as the first cohort of Yoatzot Halacha, which probably came with some controversy, I would imagine, at the time. What was it like then? Why did you do it?
So I must say, it's interesting that you say it must have come with controversy. So believe it or not, it didn't. There was nothing controversial. And I'll just give the background. I had been learning in various seminaries and teaching. And I had been teaching at that time also in Nishmat. And Rabbanit Hinkin called me. I remember it was right after teaching a class, and she said, Shani, would you like we'd like to start a cohort. It wasn't even yet called Yoatzot Halakha. They didn't have a name for it yet. We want to train women to really be experts in the area of Hilchot Nida. And my first expression I remember, she said,
So the laws of the mikveh.
the laws of mikveh, the laws of family purity law. And I said, of course. And I didn't just mean, of course, I'll join. It was, of course, women have to learn this. And I remember having a whole conversation with Rabbanit Henkin saying it's so ironic that now that women are in seminaries and there are so many advanced learning programs, what do we learn? So we learn Hilchot Shabbat in depth. We learn Hilchot Kashrut in depth. But isn't it strange that the one area where women really are ne'emanot, they are credible and responsible for keeping and actually determining their status halachically in even the legal, both the purity and also religious sense, that's one area that we usually have about 5 to maybe maximum 12 hours of learning before our married lives, and then we're expected to keep this for the rest of our lives. I say it's a crash course in halacha. And today that we're learning so many other areas in depth, of course we should learn Hilchot Nida. And before joining, so I said, of course, this is definitely something. She said, I don't even know what's going to come of this. I don't know whether or not it's going to be accepted in communities, but at least for now, you should be able to teach these laws, which I was already doing. And about, I would say, a month or two into the program, women were already calling with different questions. Oh, Shani, I hear that you're learning the laws of Nida. Can you answer this question? What do I do in this case? Which obviously only highlighted the need for such women on the field. But in the meantime, before starting, Rabbanit Hinkin was very wise. And in order to ensure that there wouldn't be any controversy, she spoke to the leading rabbi at the time, Rabbi Doron, who was the chief Sephardi rabbi. He came out in full support, and she understood that most of our cohort, the first cohort, were 80% Anglo. So we were Anglos who were living in Israel because generally within the Anglo community, you have a higher level of Talmudic scholarship. Many of us were exposed to Talmud even before seminary, definitely from seminary and on. So she said, we also need the support of rabbis in England. So Rabbi Sachs came out with full support, Zachrono Livracha. Rav Schachter, who today is a little bit more ambivalent on the issue, came out in full support. He was actually in our home that Yom Kippur, and we had Su'uda and Mafseket, the final meal before Yom Kippur, and I spoke to him about it, and he said, it's exactly, women should know these halachot, and especially dealing with women in their communities. This way, there's a means, and he saw it as a wonderful way of women discussing halachot together with the rabbanim. Right? Very often, women feel that there is a certain rift between rabbinic leadership and communal sensitivities and women's issues. And this way, these women, the Yoatzot Halakha, can also serve as a bridge between the women of the community and the rabbinic leadership. And Rabbi Willig was very much in support. So it was not only a wonderful opportunity, but Baruch Hashem started off as non-controversial. Today, perhaps depending on the community and seeing, I would say, some of the many positive effects, which I understand the rabbis who are more reserved to perhaps are wondering what the long-term effects are. I think that we see many positive.
How do you think it's changed having more a female perspective in halachic dialogue on passages of the Talmud that until 25, 50 years ago it was very much a male perspective?
Exactly. So I don't think that halacha has changed as a result, but just as you said, the perspective, or I would say the discussions, right, the dialogue. The very fact that speaking to women, I have so many stories, but even when women say, wow, it's so comfortable just being able to discuss personal issues. And what happens is that you realize that halacha is not relegated to particular, or I'm even going to say, and even parochial aspects of our lives. They're central to our lives. So when discussing sometimes something technical, you realize, wait, there are many other issues or many other factors. And it helps one appreciate the halachic system, knowing that it's not just about a yes or a no, a mutar or asur, but rather, okay, so tell me about issues going on in the relationship between yourself and your husband. And it ends up being a wonderful discussion, not just a technical give and take, but a wonderful discussion with the women. And then just as you said, with regard to discussions with Rabbanim, I encourage women, I say the only way that women are really going to influence their own Torah leadership and Torah impact is if they can engage in Torah discussion. And the only way one can do that is if one's proficient in areas of halacha. And it's beautiful. I don't even want to use the word empowering. It's just so wonderful to be able to speak to Rabbanim, to be able to quote Rishonim and Achronim, and to be a part of the process of halacha, to know that instead of just, as we see historically, instead of, I don't want to say being on the sidelines, because I think women were always involved in, as we said, strengthening Torah, but instead of from a peripheral perspective, instead of from the side, we now really get to be part of these discussions. So when people speak to me about, okay, so do you think that women are going to be dayanim on Beit Din? And I say, look, there are different teachings and unclear, but bottom line, then it doesn't really make such a difference because we're going to be the ones discussing every single issue with the Rabbanim of Beit Din, with the experts on every level. And the fact that I've seen also the transformation of the next generation, even of halachic leadership, recognizing how necessary and important it is to involve women, talmidot, chachamim, and chachamot into those discussions. All the more so, I think, is proof to how enriching this is for Torah life.
So I want to perhaps cheekily take the opportunity to take these beautiful ideals and apply them to some of what I think are pressing issues for many of us today. So there's the wonderful Talmudic story about the great sage Rabbi Yochanan, who went swimming. And at the time that he's swimming, he meets a bandit who is called Reish Lakish. And Reish Lakish encounters him. And as he encountered the bandit, he says to him, you should use your strength, your incredible physical strength, you should use and apply it to Judaism. And this was like a light bulb moment for him. And suddenly he changes his life around from being a bandit and he takes that strength and he harnesses it and he becomes one of the greatest scholars of the generation. And I think that for me and for a lot of my friends, in the time we were in your classroom, we had a real sense of that being almost a mantra of saying, you're young people with talents, with capabilities, with passions. If you can take that and apply that to your passion for Judaism, for your quest and your thirst for knowledge, go and do it. And I think we really have seen that in terms of women's scholarship. But I think there are a lot of people who feel like, okay, that's great, but learning, yes, I'll learn to the best of my ability, but scholarship's not for me. But, there are many areas of ritual in Judaism that I would love to access. That's where I would like to feel that I can use my talents, my passions, and apply them. And that's where in Orthodox Judaism, as women, it becomes a much trickier area. So how would you advise when it comes to that?
I'm so excited that you remember the Chilech L'Oraita, because I still believe that that's really what each and every one of us should do. Take our own passions, our own talents, and that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us, to channel them towards Avodat Hashem. So the question is, within the realm of ritual, right? Just as you said, there really aren't any glass ceilings in Torah scholarship today for women, which in itself I find also just very fulfilling and satisfying. But how do we then bring it into the realm, I'm going to say, of the Beit Knesset? So firstly, it's interesting to note that throughout our generations, it really has been more, the Beit Midrash has always been more of a core of Jewish life. This is where chidush, this is where novelties and new ideas and discussions come out of. And the Beit Knesset is more the assembly, as you said, more the space for community. And the question then is women within a community leadership. So when it comes to rituals, I'm sure many of you have encountered, that's where there is much more reservation by virtue of the fact that so much of ritual is really linked not necessarily to, well, get into issues of law and as much as tradition. Therefore, there really is a sense of continuing ritual as part of, you may hear the term misorah, right? As part of the tradition, because so much of tradition, and I feel I can quote, Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, is really as part of what ties the community together. And as soon as we start breaking apart areas and aspects of ritual, whether it's the wedding ceremonies or whether it's, the communal activities in the Beit Knesset, then all of a sudden, part of the core of Judaism becomes somewhat diluted. And that's why there really is reservation, just to give a little bit of background. At the same time, women, I certainly understand this and feel this very often. Women say, but this doesn't make any sense because now that we have the knowledge and now that we have the skills, why can't we? And also have ritual affected as well. And this is why I say that one not only has to be patient, but one first has to learn. I just had a discussion less than an hour ago with a student who was very frustrated how in her community, she went to the rabbi and she said that she was just so inspired. She had been in an egalitarian minyan and she wants to now have a kriyat megillah lenashim. She wants a Torah reading for women within the community. And there were many discussions back and forth, and the rabbi sat with her and explained how, at least as of now, he doesn't feel it's the right time for a Megillah reading for the women. And she was very.
Is it Megillah or Torah reading?
Megillah. I said Torah, I meant Megillah.
Originally Megillah,
Oh,
and
yes,
then went into
Megillah.
Torah. I wasn't sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, Megillah, thank you. Megillah, but that was exactly one of the reservations of the rabbi. So you see, it's in my subconscious because the rabbi said, my sense is really you want Torah reading. And when it comes to Torah reading, there are various halachot, meaning it's not just about ritual. There are halachot of women saying brachot, and we don't take our blessings in vain, and we don't take them. We have to treat the usage of the name of Hashem very respectfully. And it's true that there is place and there is room and there are not only allowances, but women can fulfill the mitzvah of kriyat megillah for other women. Said that the sense is that maybe if it's really coming from a sense of egalitarian, wait a second, we don't want to necessarily change the entire infrastructure of a community. So one has to be very sensitive. So that's exactly what I tell my students. Start off, number one, with scholarship. Start off with learning. Understand that it can't just come from the heart. It can't just come, this is what I want, this is what I feel, this is what brings me closer to God. Because we know from too many stories in Tanakh how even if I want to bring fire to God, like Nadav and Abihu, we have to remember that ritual is the way that God wants us to worship him. And sometimes, man or woman, we have to learn how it's not about us mandating how we worship God, but God mandates how we worship God. So I had to recognize that. At the same time, to know that there really is a tremendous amount of room for women to participate today within the realm of halacha, but therefore one has to learn all these aspects of halacha. And as I was reviewing with her, even certain nuances with regard to kriyat megillah lenashim, there is a machloket between the Gaonim and Rishonim with regard to if a woman is the one who's reading Megillah, then she only fulfills the aspect of Shmiya, with which she is required. But if a man, it's Shmiya and Kriya. And the question is also, is it a whole group of women? For example, there are many who, when they're in Midrasham, this is always very difficult, when they're in their seminaries, they're a tzibur, they're an entire community. And that's the best way to publicize the miracle of Purim. So of course, better for them to read Megillah with 500 students than to go up to a shul and read it with 20 men. But when one is in a community, you also have to take other factors into account, whether it's Prisham and Hatzibur, separating from the tzibur, from the general community, whether it's, again, what are the long-term ramifications in terms of, do you see yourself as a part of a community, or is there, again, the women's community, the men's community? And I think that these are obviously very sensitive issues for each community, but at the same time, with regard to ritual, to be, number one, knowledgeable, secondly, to be sensitive, thirdly, to take all different factors into account, thinking not only of the here and now, but also certain long-term ramifications. But I think it starts really from already being a chacham haroet hanolad, thinking of the next generation. We can't just think of what do I want for now? What do I want for my daughter? What do I want for some of us, for our granddaughters? How do I want them to see the Beit Knesset? Do I want them to see it as the men's domain, or do I want them to feel comfortable in the realm of tefillah? And especially when it comes to tefillah, to aspects of ritual prayer, there's so much space. I say there's so much leeway for women because we don't have the same requirements of that communal space. And to a certain degree, we can create that communal space, whether I think a beautiful idea is to have the Kabbalat Shabbat for women, to create that space of singing and to create obviously learning opportunities within the Beit Knesset for women as well, to create, to have, I don't know what the Beit Knesset looks like inside, I should really take a peek, but to have.
You should.
I should, yes.
You might be surprised.
Beautiful. Are the women on the same level as the men, which is beautiful. I think this way one does feel more part of the tzibur, and to recognize at the same time that ritual is something that we have to be all the more cautious about because it is part of the rubric of tradition.
And if we're talking prayer, do we have time for one more question? So if we're talking next generation, right? And I think this is pressing for all of us, you know, Jewish continuity, do the next generation connect? Prayer is something that comes back to what you said before. It is about what we feel, how we connect. I think a lot of people feel challenged with prayer. You know, Rabbi Sachs spoke about it being one of the greatest challenges that we have as Jews today. And when we look at the prayer service, you know, so much that it's so beautifully built on so many passages of Tanakh that you teach. And in fact, in the Mizrachi magazine that you might have picked up, you wrote a beautiful piece about the prayer that we say every single day about people being healed, that are sick, the prayer for the sick that we say, which was in the Haftarah, that you wrote beautifully about. How important do you think it is that people appreciate the context of where the prayers have come from? Could that be a key to connecting the younger generation with prayer? What would be your best advice?
Wow, I have so much to say about this, but in one word, yes. And the answer is yes, it's essential. And by that I mean that you're right, many of, particularly the youth, feel very disconnected from prayer because they're communicating with everyone, everywhere at the same time, receiving answers and, you know, the double checks within seconds. And now we feel, okay, if I talk to God, there's no response. And part of appreciating prayer goes back, and Rav Soloveitchik speaks a lot about this, how the only way to really understand the nature of prayer is to go back to what a relationship with God is all about. And from the earliest times, from the times of the patriarchs, even before that, we see communication and we see how it evolves basically through prophecy. And the closest thing that we have today to prophecy, or some will even argue, like Rav Soloveitchik, that the replacement for prophecy today is prayer, which means that the only way that we're going to understand that is to go back to the words of the prophets and to understand what it means to literally try to connect with God and through our words, through not just our emotions, but a certain level of consciousness. And when we do, we really do connect. I'm going to ask everyone, and this is something that I work on also with students of all ages, including my own peers and adult education. And that is to really try to engage in tefillah workshops, which, as Lauren beautifully said, begin with understanding the context of our tefillot from Tanakh. Right? When you say the brachot hashachar in the morning, something as very mundane, but also perhaps as technical and maybe even automatic, when we give praises to God, each one is rooted in a different prophecy, in a different term. Even when we wake up in the morning and we say, Moda ani lefanacha, malachai v'kayam shechazarta bi nishmati b'chamla, Rabba emunatacha. Anyone know where that's from? Rabba emunatacha. That God has tremendous faith in us. It's from, believe it or not, Megillat Icha. Right, the Lamentations, where Yirmiyahu, in the midst of a terrible destruction, says, Chadashim labkarim, every morning is a new morning, Rabba emunatacha. Wow, that transforms the way that we wake up in the morning. That means that every day is a new opportunity. that every day, no matter how bad yesterday was, can be a better day. That's exactly what Yirmiyahu Hanavi is saying. When you say the bracha in the morning, Hanotein la'ya'id koach, to realize, oh my, this is what Yeshayahu is saying. He's saying, Ya'ufu, then go and fly. Hanotein la'ya'id koach Hashem, Ya'ufu below yiga'u. And he's talking about within the realm of how to serve God with passion and excitement. It's not just about, okay, Hashem, give me my cup of coffee and let me have strength to get through the next hour of the day. No, it's Hashem, instill within me the energy to worship you with everything that I have. And when you see it inside, and when these words come to life, then that means that your communication with God, your consciousness of a relationship with God comes to life. One of the workshops that I do is really just to not only see the psukim, the verses inside, but then for everyone to go off to a different corner. It works very nicely on hilltops in Yerushalayim. Go off to a different corner, a different hilltop, and just talk to God. Just talk. And then be quiet and see if you can actually hear God talking to you. And I implore all of you, try to do this. If you really are in touch, both with yourselves and with God, and a sense of a trajectory of where you want to be in your relationship with God. I know this sounds a little prophetic perhaps, but it really does, it does happen. You hear these voices, you hear, and you can feel this communication with God. And I think that the more in touch we are with the Torah, especially the words of Chumash, these are the words of Hashem. Nahama Leibowitz would say it so beautifully. She says, learn every pasuk, every nuance. Realize that this is a love letter from God to us. And just like all of us would analyze every comma, every little vowel in a love letter, and the love letter, there's so much there, both the words themselves, the nuances between the lines, between even the Tamei HaMikra, the cancellations, the more that we're engaged in this letter of Hashem, the more that enhances our communication and certainly our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Beautiful. It might not be the hilltops of Yerushalayim, but we are lucky to have Hummer's Hill. I think we have time for one or two questions.
Is that it?
This is just the beginning. Shani's coming back to do a prayer workshop for us, I think.
As a mother of young people, young adults, you talked about how it's difficult these days for a connection with youngsters because they're expecting an immediate response or immediate reaction from something or something. How would you, as an educator, enable young people to connect more readily, or what would you suggest that they do or we do?
Beautiful. So I'm going to focus on the second part, which is I don't think we should give them those immediate answers. And I think instead of catering to shortcuts in society, which, as you know, on every level is being done, both on the business level, the financial level, the psychological level even, right? Immediate enjoyment and pleasure. I think we're thwarting the potential growth of our children, instead to instill within them the satisfaction of a process, to teach them what it means to day in and day out. As I'll say, one of the most important psukim of the Torah is that to bring the kebes baboker and kebes ben ha'arbayim, the day in, day out korban tamid, to teach them consistency, to teach them what it means to truly toil over something. And if they do that, and by the way, it can be any little project to give them. And as parents, if we don't provide this for our children, we're doing a disservice for the short term and also for the long term. Give your children a project. It can be to finish a book. It can be to finish a Mishnah, a Masachet of Mishnayot, to teach them what it means, and to give them, we can incentivize them in many different ways, a gift card, or, okay, we'll have a siyum, whatever it may be, with a special trip, time together with your parents, without cell phones, right? Whatever it may be. And they themselves are going to appreciate that satisfaction that, unfortunately, I truly believe that so many children aren't privy to that satisfaction that comes after a long-term investment, because society and parents aren't providing that for our children. If we can give that to them and instill it over and over again, wow, you finished one Masachet, you finished Harry Potter 1, great, now it's time to read Harry Potter 2, no cliff notes, right? And no watching the movie before and to teach them what that the value really of hard work and a process that's going to really edify them for the rest of their lives.
Salama?
Thank you, Robin and Shani. It was very interesting. You mentioned the word passions. Can you envision a time in the future where a woman could count in a minyan?
Interesting. Very interesting. So I get this question a lot. And I'm going to say not a minyan, but yes, a tzibur. Why do I say that? Because the more you learn halakha, yes, a minyan, thank you. A minyan is a group of 10 men that Chazal, based on teachings of verses, that Chazal established. And the reason I say based on teaching of verses is that it has a higher level of, I'm going to say, halachic status, that it has basically a biblical mandate that 10 men constitute a minyan, a group for which you can say the name of God in certain contexts, such as the Kedusha that we say in Shmona Esrei, the Kaddish that is said, and certain rituals, such as formal Kriyat HaTorah, at the Torah reading. And that's really more or less, right, about it, which we learned from the context. I always find it ironic. We learned from the 10 spies, right, which were men, because women didn't even participate in that sin. So it's somewhat ironic. And there's a lot that can be learned from that as well, that maybe we don't need 10 men, right, to not just to sanctify God. We have other means of worshiping God, but without getting into apologetics, which, as you know, many do. So no, I don't think, unless we have a Beit Din that's going to reformulate certain halachot, which I am very skeptical, and I don't think is very healthy for the maintenance of halachic teachings and halachic infrastructure. So no, I don't think women will be part of a minyan. What I do think, and what I do see, and what I do encourage, is that women be more part of the tzibur, that more of what goes on within our day-to-day communal worshiping of God occurs on a tzibur, which is literally a public sphere or a communal level. And that for sure. So for example, the idea of Megillah L'Nashim doesn't require a minyan, but we have a tzibur. Or so much of, is it better to daven with a tzibur, with a community, or the yechidut? Right, so definitely as a community. So women should be getting together as a community. Now, halachically, it's better for her to participate in areas where there is a minyan, so that she could also sanctify the name of God in public. But in so many, I say this is something that I'm really working on now, and I'm going to get Lauren involved. And in fact, to create really an institute of enriching women's Torah community leadership. That women should be more involved in that tzibur level. They should be more involved in what goes on and the goings on of the Beit Knesset, whether it's bat mitzvah programming, whether it's continued learning, whether it's having Motzei Shabbat, Malava Malkas. When was the last time you had a community Malava Malka? Okay, don't answer. But now, I think that the women should really be involved in helping to create many of these both more formal learning and also informal religious and spiritual opportunities.
Okay, Dan will be the last one.
Just the partnership minyan anywhere in
The partnership minyanim.
there.
But and so that's an excellent question. And this is what I feel like this is a line that I find myself saying very often. That you could have a very halachically, you could have a halachically approved partnership minyan. I'm going to say it that way. In other words, there are opinions within every area of what goes on in a minyan, where, or particularly a partnership minyan, where women can, according to some opinions of halakha, be more involved, right? So for example, let's say, Psuke Dizimra, you have a woman leading the initial services of Tefillah before you get to the Shmona Esrei and Kedusha. Technically, she's part of that tzibur. There's nothing wrong with it, right? Meaning I can technically, that would technically be allowed. Or for example, a woman who's already said Berchot HaTorah, she can get up to read from the Torah without saying the brachot if she's already said the blessings of the Torah, but you can't necessarily include other people in it, but we can allow her to participate. I said, firstly, if you really learn each one of these topics inside, you'll find that there's halachic basis, but it's not mainstream halachic basis. And therefore, partnership minyanim as well, they're not based on mainstream consensus in halacha. And as we know, the way that the halachic system, as any legal system, is perpetuated is through a mainstream consensus, right? We call it in Hebrew, acharei rabim lahatot. And therefore, even though I can't tell you that it's against halacha, but it definitely is not something within that mainstream, which means that chances are that it will not be perpetuated for the long term. Which is why I speak to educators about this all the time, and really now to community leaders and scholars, that I think we have to be very wise, particularly with regard to women's role, and not just think about the short term, and not be, and I'm going to use this term, but not even being selfish, right? In the sense of this brings me closer to God, but ask oneself, what are really the endeavors in which I can engage that will ensure that my daughters, my granddaughters are going to feel that they are an intrinsic and integral part of the Jewish community. So instead of investing my efforts and energies in short-lived ephemeral phenomena, I would rather invest in long-term, both participation, passion, excitement, and perhaps even leadership opportunities for the next generation.
Now really one more. Yeah.
Really
I don't know what to say.
so some of us may wonder that there wasn't mainstream consensus about women learning Talmud. It required brave rabbanim, and the fact that you are part of this burgeoning learning that happened, especially through Rabbi Riskin, Rabbi Brovender in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, that has allowed this burgeoning because it required more people to do it, facts on the ground for mainstream opinions. So I just when to retreat to a point to say partnership minyanim, maybe halachically there may be minority opinions, but it's not mainstream, and therefore someone said that 50 years ago, but you benefited. So I'd like to.
So I'm so happy you said this, because 30 years ago, when I would speak about partnership minyanim, I would add in the word, whenever I said it's not mainstream halachic consensus yet.
Yeah.
I would always say the word yet, because 30 years ago, I really believed, and I would say that, don't worry, just wait about 30 years. 30 years later, it's still not, in which case, as opposed to women in Talmud Torah, and you're 100% right, that if I look back historically, I see that it was always there, and that there always were, right, some women who were learning, especially independently, and we can go throughout, not just Berea, throughout Jewish history, and it was never considered, again, completely forbidden in the sense of a woman could always learn certain aspects, and they should, and especially the Rambam, Maimonides, who said that, okay, fathers should necessarily teach it to their daughters, always said that women have to learn the lechem and basar, they always have to learn halacha. So that was always part of the system. And let me say, before we get even to Rabbi Riskin and Rabbi Bravender, let's give Sarah Schneer a little credit, right? She's the one who really saw that women's religious fervor and commitment to halacha was being diluted because they were exposed to so many high-level secular studies. And she's the one who really started, together with, she was a Belzer Chassid, together with the approval of the Belzer Chassid, and only later did the Lithuanians, did the Chafetz Chaim, right, ends up giving approval as well. And then, you're right, we're the product of that long-term process where we saw many positive benefits, right? Namely, religious rigor being restored both to the Jewish household, to the Jewish communities, and certainly within the realm of Jewish education today. So I can look back and, you're right, appreciate that it's an evolution. I think maybe because looking back now the past 30 years and seeing that in the realm of ritual, and I understand and appreciate why it's a much more gradual process. And because of, as we said, the sensitivities to tradition, much more difficult to affect change for good reasons, for good. I wouldn't want the traditional system to break apart, because this is really what has kept Judaism alive for 3,000 years, especially in diasporan communities. So to maybe rethink where I want to place my energies. That's really more, I'm going to say, a personal reflection, which I hope is also a communal reflection. And seeing now 30 years after partnership and Yanim have already been off the ground, seeing something interesting, how what used to be women's tefillah groups where women would get together and they would pray together and they would say blessings together, believe it or not, became very popular in Bnei Brak. Do you know that? You know, the wife of the Stifler, Rabbi Kanievsky, or actually the daughter-in-law, and she would have these Vatican, can't even call them minyanim, these Vatican tefillot with women, and now they exist throughout the world. Whereas partnership minyanim, I've seen have just not become as popular, not become as widespread, not become as mainstream over the past 30 years. You're 100% right. Could that be different in 30 years from now? It could be. And yet I'm more cautious of incorporating the word yet, because I've seen that it hasn't changed over the past 30 years. So I'd rather us put our energies where I really do see an enhancement of the Jewish community.
You mentioned the morning blessing where we ask God to give us strength. So perhaps that's exactly Hannah Peliakov, you should be blessed with the car to keep continuing, model lamed, to be able to learn, to be able to teach, to influence a global jury in the way that you are doing. Thank you so much for joining us.